Hello class and welcome to the Chapter 3 presentation on carbohydrates. Much of the beginning of this chapter is a review, but then it will move into explaining why and in particular when carbs are important for athletes to consume. So in Chapter 3 we will cover why carbs are important, how many carbs should be consumed per day by the athlete. The glycemic index and glycemic load will be presented in a separate video on our course Blackboard site. We will examine how carbs are used during exercise, and then finally what to eat before, during, and after exercise. Carbohydrates and their impact on athletic performance have been studied extensively since the 1970s, but as early as the 1920s and 30s, studies were performed showing that carbs used during exercise could be influenced by diet, and that this could have an effect on exercise tolerance. Some of the earliest peer-reviewed studies of carbohydrates, such as the ones listed on this slide, found that the glycogen content of working muscle is a determinant for the capacity to perform long-term heavy exercise. And over the last 40 to 50 years, a general consensus has been reached that carb intake is important to optimize endurance performance. And although carbohydrates often get bad press for causing obesity, raising blood sugar levels, and causing depression or hyperactive behavior, they're essential and appropriate levels for optimal athletic performance and recovery. Now, the timing of carbohydrate consumption before, during, and after a competition or event is also quite important for athletes to understand. What functions do carbohydrates serve in our bodies? Although you often hear that athletes need more protein or protein is crucial for muscle repair and recovery, while some of this information is true, it can also get blown out of proportion. In actuality, carbohydrates are the most important energy source for the body. They provide 4 kilocalories per gram of food and are the primary energy source during exercise and are the only energy source for high-intensity exercise. Carbohydrates can also provide energy for the cells of the central nervous system and red blood cells. Another important function of carbs is that cells need a small amount of glucose to properly metabolize fat for energy. When someone's following a low-carb or high-protein diet or has poorly controlled diabetes, their cells must use greater amounts of fat for energy. When there's not enough glucose to metabolize fat efficiently, an enormous amount of ketone bodies form. Our bodies can use ketone bodies for energy, but ketosis can occur when ketones build up in the blood. And if not treated, severe ketosis can lead to a loss of consciousness and even death. We'll talk more about this in the chapter on fats. Another function of carbs is the prevention of catabolism, which can be of particular concern to athletes. If an athlete exercises for long periods of time or is fasting, the body uses up its preferred source of energy, glycogen and glucose. When this happens, the body can start to break down body tissue, such as muscle, in order to burn the protein as energy. Eating adequate amounts of carbs, especially at the right times, can prevent catabolism of muscle tissue. So now that we've briefly covered the functions of carbs, how many should we eat per day? Now this will vary depending on the athlete, but mostly depends on the athlete's body weight, energy needs, metabolic demands, and stage of training or competition schedule. The RDA for carbohydrates for adults and children is 130 grams per day, which is based on the amount of sugars and starches required to provide the brain with a sufficient supply of glucose, since the brain can only be fueled by glucose. How much of your total calorie intake should come from carbs? Carbs should make up the largest percentage of your calories, but again, this will vary from person to person. The acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or AMDR, for carbs is approximately 45 to 65% of your daily calories, and most athletes need to consume 3 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight. So why is this recommended range so wide? Mainly to make up for workout intensities as they may change from day to day, and to maintain energy levels for the athlete. Now let's look at an example of how to calculate carbohydrate intake need on the next slide. We can find out our daily carbohydrate needs based on our current body weight. The general recommendation for carb needs for an athlete is 3 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, using this extremely general range, you can calculate your daily needs. As an example, if an athlete weighs in at 158 pounds, we will first need to convert pounds to kilograms by dividing our weight by the conversion factor of 2.2. In this case, the athlete weighs 71.8 kilograms. To get the range for this athlete, multiply the lower end of the range, 3 grams per kilogram of body weight, by 71.8 kilograms, then multiply the upper limit, 12 grams per kilogram, by 71.8 kilograms. The very general daily carbohydrate needs for this athlete is anywhere from 215 grams to 862 grams. If you look at table 3.6 in the textbook, you can see how various types of training can change this range. For instance, someone training intensely may need to increase the lower part of the range to ensure they're taking in enough carbohydrate. And this is where a sports nutritionist is very helpful, as he or she can assist the athlete in determining how many carbs need to be consumed based on the athlete's total calorie intake per day and their current level of training or activity. Carbohydrate needs will slightly increase as training volume increases. Not all carbohydrate-rich foods are created equal, and although oftentimes you hear a negative connotation associated with carbs, we must remember that carb-rich foods are the foundation of a healthy diet. However, some carbs are healthier than others. So what are some high-quality carbs that athletes can consume to ensure they're fueling their bodies appropriately? The healthiest carbohydrates are found in vegetables, fruits, legumes, beans, and whole grains. Whole grains are key as they not only have a fiber-rich outer bran layer, but they have the nutrient-rich germ in the endosperm, which is the starchy middle layer of the grain. You can see in the photo on this slide that all that's left after refining a grain is the starch, and much of the nutrients have been removed. These foods listed on this slide are much more nutrient dense than foods such as high sugar cereals and snack cakes, for instance, which provide many empty calories. Although fat can be used for fuel during exercise, our bodies prefer to use carbohydrates since they can be broken down for energy anaerobically or aerobically, depending on the athlete's activity. Recall from Chapter 2 that during rest or low to moderate exercises, both fatty acids and carbs can be metabolized for energy. If you take a look at Figure 3.7 in the textbook, you will see a graphic reviewing the metabolic pathways used to convert carbohydrates to ATP. Building on the previous slide, as exercise intensifies, carbohydrates become the sole source of energy for the body. Since oxygen delivery during high-intensity aerobic activities becomes limited, the body will move to carbohydrates for fuel because they are able to provide the most energy under the circumstance of lower oxygen availability. The crossover point is the term used to describe the body's switch from using both fats and carbs for energy to using only carbohydrates as fuel. If you take a look at Figure 3.8 in your textbook, which is also depicted on this slide, you can see that activities to the left of the crossover point can primarily utilize fats for energy, and as the athlete becomes more conditioned due to training, their crossover point will move more to the right and enable them to rely more on fats than carbs for energy. Since the body's carbohydrate stores are limited, relying on fats for energy spares glycogen and delays fatigue in the athlete. As you've read in this chapter, glycogen is stored not only in the liver but in the muscles. However, these stores are limited and only the glycogen stored in the liver can be directly released into the bloodstream when the body needs it to maintain blood glucose levels. So restricting carbs is not necessarily a good idea for the athlete, as fatigue can set in a lot quicker without keeping our glycogen stores up. Depletion of glycogen in both the liver and muscles can be detrimental to an athlete's performance. You can see in Figure 3.9 from the book, the initial muscle glycogen level is directly related to how long in minutes until an athlete fatigues. For instance, if the athlete's initial muscle glycogen level before exercise is 2 grams per 100 grams of muscle, will take about 120 minutes for the conditioned athlete to reach a point of fatigue, about twice the time it would take for someone on a more restricted carbohydrate diet. Continued low blood glucose can lead to loss of mental focus and chronic fatigue, ultimately leading to poor performance on the field, court, or track. To keep an athlete's glycogen stores up, what should he or she eat in the days leading up to a competition? There is not one best pre-game meal, beverage, or snack, but there are a few guidelines that athletes should consider when it comes to carbs. However, as said on the previous slide, increasing glycogen stores can delay fatigue and possibly enhance performance. The athlete should focus on a well-balanced diet of familiar foods so you know your body can tolerate the carbs before exercise. In other words, if you normally don't eat much hummus and don't know how your body will react to it, you may want to avoid it in the few days leading up to an event. Since it's made of chickpeas and these contain some indigestible carbs, it could cause gas and bloating. In short, if you don't know how your body will handle a new food before a competition or game is not the time to try it. Now, many athletes are interested in carb loading, in particular endurance and ultra endurance athletes. I have attached a separate short video within the Blackboard site related to this topic, so be sure to take a look at that about carb loading. Now, as an athlete approaches the hours before a competition, how should he or she handle the ingestion of carbs? The 4 to 24 hour period before a competition is the time to top off your glycogen stores by making about 60 to 70% of your total calories those from carbs. The athlete will also want to consume some protein and fat to keep a feeling of satiety or fullness. Again, the athlete should eat familiar foods so no GI distress occurs during the game or event. Now, 4 hours to 0 hours before a competition, the athlete will want to eat easily digestible carbs that contain very little fiber. Consumption of 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight is recommended. And those should be small meals of complex carbs, which will elevate blood sugar. This should not be a time to guess whether or not a food will agree with you. In fact, diet experimentation should be a part of the athlete's training plan weeks or even months prior to a big competition or event. Now, what types of carbs should be consumed during the actual sport or exercise? So glucose polymers, fructose, and starches are all absorbed quickly and are considered good fuels for exercise. And there are many sport nutrition products on the market today that contain these types of carbohydrates, such as sports gels, bars, and drinks. You can refer to Table 3.11 in your book for the carbohydrate content of many of the common sports nutrition products that are on the market today. Now, although recommendations suggest consuming 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour during competition, this can vary widely from athlete to athlete, and it's dependent on the type of activity. Ultra endurance athletes, such as those where athletes run 50 to even 100 miles at a time, can consume upwards of 90 grams per hour due to the strenuous nature of the events. Now, I did a little bit of research. If you're interested in reading about ultra endurance events, look up this one particular one called the Western States 100-Mile Endurance Run at www.wser.org to see just how physically challenging an event like this could be and how the consistent need for carbs could come into play. I was absolutely amazed at what these athletes have to endure in this race. So gels, drinks, bars, or other carbs should be consumed soon after the onset of exercise and be continued at regular intervals to prevent fatigue in the athletes. Finally, what and how much should an athlete eat after competition? In general, those of us who exercise recreationally, like myself, or who train 3 to 4 times per week do not have to worry about how slow glycogen replenishment rates are because there's a time between workouts for our bodies to recover. However, for endurance athletes who train daily, carb intake type and timing must be tightly regulated. Research has shown that if carbs are consumed within 2 hours after exercise, glycogen is restored more quickly than if the athlete waits longer to eat. So it's important for athletes to have portable, easily accessible carb snacks for post exercise, such as a sports gel, maybe a medium sized banana, or a quarter cup of raisins. Food should be consumed in 1 to 1.2 gram per kilogram of body weight every hour for 4 hours post exercise to maximize glycogen synthesis. Now, to recap, this chapter was packed full of information. In fact, it took a lot for me to condense this presentation to a manageable length. Now, we went over the importance of carbs as related to exercise, how many carbs should be consumed per day, and how and what kind of carbs should be consumed before, during, and after exercise. Now, if you have any questions about anything covered in this presentation, just contact me and I'll gladly discuss it with you. I know it was a lot of information in one sitting. So write those questions down and send them my way. I hope you have a great night.